As I said, the real meaning of the All Saints part of All Saints Sunday is about the whole communion of saints. And it's that whole communion of saints that we hear about in the first reading this morning from the Revelation to John. In that very symbolic picture that John draws, he pictures the entire communion of saints at the end of time in front of God. He says, "After this I looked, and there was a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, from all tribes and peoples and languages, standing before the throne, before the Lamb, from every nation, from all tribes, all peoples, all languages." The communion of saints. But before that picture happens, as the reading goes on, this whole communion of saints has come through a great ordeal. It reminds me of a book that I read that was very formative in my life. My kids say it was back in the day. You know what that means when your kids say it's back in the day. It was only in 1978. How far back?
Back in the day.
But back in the day. It was a book by a psychologist called Scott Peck, The Road Less Traveled. How many of you have read that book? Several of you have. Well, it began with 3 little words. And the 3 little words were these: life is difficult. And those 3 little words have sort of gone down in history, because life is difficult. And life always has been difficult. I don't know why then it surprises us so much when it's difficult. I mean, it has been from time to time for generations, ever since life has ever existed, that life has not been an easy thing. And yet every time something happens and there's a difficulty or something goes wrong, we act like we're kind of surprised, you know? Like we expected that life should be easy and not difficult. But that's not the way it is. And it's not the way it ever has been. And it wasn't that way for those Christians in the late part of the 1st century who first heard in their churches this piece of writing by John. Life was difficult for them. In fact, it was so difficult you might call it quite an ordeal. And it is to them that John writes this piece. So I want you to imagine being them for just a minute. Back in the late part of the 1st century. You're in one of these little churches that John has founded in what was then called Asia Minor. Now that would be modern-day Turkey. Little bitty communities, struggling just to get by. And yet not only were they struggling to get by, they were up against the whole Roman Empire. Because simply by saying that Jesus was Lord, as of course they did, say Jesus is Lord, it put them up against the entire empire. Because for the empire, the Lord was the emperor. In fact, people were expected to acknowledge the emperor is Lord, and on many inscriptions it also included Son of God. And anybody who was not willing to say the emperor is Lord and Son of God was suspect as a traitor. So first of all, you have these little communities who say Jesus is Lord, and just by saying that, it puts them up against the entire Roman Empire. That's a very difficult situation to be in. Those who were vocal about it, some were in prison, some were sent into exile like John was. Some were killed. Those who weren't quite so vocal, they might not put their lives at stake, but they found their lives becoming gradually diminished. Because if you said Jesus was Lord rather than the emperor was Lord, you could lose your job and have a very difficult time finding any other kind of job to have. And not only that, you might be sort of set aside by many of your friends who would be afraid that perhaps if they had you to their house for a party or for dinner, that it might be thought that they also were traitorous Christians. And what's more, if you were a Jewish Christian, as a good number of them still were, even though there were Gentile Christians at that time, the synagogue was gradually becoming more and more careful about identifying itself up against these new little fledgling communities. And so you can find yourself also cut off from your mother, your father, your sister, your brother, your cousins, your best friends. You might find yourself shunned by the very people who are dearest to you. Now take just a minute and let all of that sink in. Life was difficult. If it wasn't already an ordeal for you as a member of one of these small little Christian churches, then it would soon be. A man named John, who was exiled to Patmos, began to think about these little churches that he had helped start. He worried about them. He worried about the people in them, whether they would be imprisoned, exiled, or killed. He worried also whether they would simply give up on the whole belief in the power of Christ, because it was just too hard and just too dangerous. And he was far away, already exiled, and so he prayed for them, and he meditated on the situation. And one day in those meditations, he had a vision. He had a vision that, as all visions are, came through to him in many, many different symbolic ways. But the vision was clear. It was a revelation. It was a revelation that those who would endure the ordeal, those who would keep the faith in the power of Christ throughout this ordeal, they would find the blessing. They would find the blessing. And so he wanted to write this message back to these churches to be read. And he chose to write it in a form that was very popular in Jewish scripture, in our Old Testaments today. It's called apocalyptic writing. And as you read the Old Testament and find in different places where there is apocalyptic writing, apocalyptic simply means about end times. When you find them, they always came up. Whether it was the prophets or other writers, this always came up at times when the people of Israel, the people of faith, were being kind of put to the test by the culture around them. When the culture around them was hostile to them. Sometimes the whole culture had sent them into exile. Other times it was simply exploiting them or making their life an ordeal. But in all these times we find these apocalyptic writings coming up. And they all pretty much carry this message that this may be horrible for you now. You may be going through this ordeal because of your faith. But in the end, God will make everything right. And that was the message. And so John took that powerful message to the people of his own day who were going through their own ordeal and wrote the revelation that he had had in a vision in the form of an apocalyptic piece of writing, and smuggled it in that it might be circulated through those churches and read, to encourage them, to give them hope, to give them this one undying message. In the face of your great difficulties, keep faith in the power of Christ, because those who endure the ordeal will be blessed. It's the same message we get in the Beatitudes. The same message. Because each Beatitude describes a situation of life that is difficult. A situation of life in which we all find ourselves at some times in our life, in each one of these. Sometimes literally, sometimes symbolically, sometimes just a little bit, sometimes to the point where it's an incredible ordeal. But take out the reading. It's in here. It's in this for you. Take out the reading where it says what the gospel that we just read. And look at these Beatitudes just a minute. And see the difficulties that cross generations that it describes. Blessed are the poor in spirit. There are circumstances in which we are poor in spirit. Now we'd call it down in spirit, Or we might call it depression if it was really serious. But there are times in life in which we fall into a poorness of spirit where we just don't have the spirit to get up almost, or to see how life could possibly work out. Those are difficult times, and for some they're even ordeals. We will mourn. There are times when we will mourn. We mourn the people that those candles represent. We mourn the people we remember today who we've lost and loved. We mourn losing our own health. We mourn losing our ability to do this or that. We mourn losing dreams. Life is full of times when there are things to be mourned. We have times when we bump up against our limits. That's what meek really means here. Meek does not mean kind of mousy and never doing. What meek is having a real connection to the earth and knowing that we have limits. Knowing that as human beings we are not God and we are not superhuman. We are human beings with limits. And when we bump up against those limits, life is difficult because we rarely like to admit that we have limits. And there are times in life when we're treated unfairly, when we're unjustly blamed, perhaps, or maybe even exploited. And at those times we hunger and we thirst for somebody somewhere just to set it right. And there are times when in relationships with individuals and sometimes in relationships between groups and nations, there are times when the only thing left is mercy. And there are times when the only way we can see our way through to where God might be leading us is to purify our own hearts of the negative thoughts and feelings that keep us stuck. And there are times when there are situations that the only thing left for us to do is to make peace. These are difficult times. They are parts and parcel of the ordeal that each one of us goes through in our lifetime. It's a description of the human condition and the fact that, yes, indeed, life is difficult. But the message of John, the same revelation he had for those people that he left behind in Turkey, is the same revelation for us, that in the midst of these difficulties, in the midst of the times that we have all these circumstances that the Beatitudes describe, in the very midst of that, we can trust in the power of Christ. And if we make our way through the ordeal, we will find blessing. Now, the thing to specifically notice about these Beatitudes is that the blessing is always hidden right in the middle of a difficult circumstance. You don't have to wait for it. The blessing is right there, in the midst of being poor in spirit. You have the opportunity to see a whole different way of life. And sometimes, for some of us, it takes getting down to that bottom before we're willing to even look at the possibility that there could be a different kingdom of heaven type of life. And in our mourning, when we are really willing to let ourselves mourn, and we're willing to let someone else comfort us, there is a blessing not only in receiving the comfort, but in finally knowing what it really is to comfort somebody else. Henry Nouwen once said, the best healer is a wounded healer. We know best how to comfort others when we have allowed ourselves to be comforted. And in the midst of hungering and thirsting for somebody to set it right, just our desire to have a right relationship somehow will lead us into better relationships. And when we get rid of the negative thoughts and feelings, we're always in a much better position to see where God's leading us. In each one of these Beatitudes, there is a hidden blessing. Because the promise of God is that although life is difficult, if we engage the difficulties, continuing to trust in the power of Christ, to heal, then we'll be better able to live through the difficulty. And in living through the difficulty, we'll find the blessing. So on this All Saints' Day, may each of us look for the blessing and not be afraid to claim it. And may we keep the faith. Amen.